Um, Dr. Nadia Lahutsky is here with us tonight. She's an associate professor at TCU in the religion department. I actually never had the privilege of taking a class from her, but Jill said she majored in her and said she is wonderful. So we're glad that she's with us tonight. She has a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas, Catholicism being one of the many ones. She received a BA with honors from Hiram College with majors in religion and Spanish. So maybe we'll make you brush up on your Spanish tonight. So, she earned the MA and the PhD from Vanderbilt in the history of Christianity and history of Christian thought. Her interest in modern Roman Catholicism led to the study of the modernist controversy of the early 20th century, as well as the effects of the Vatican II. She's also interested in the roles of women and attitudes toward women exhibited in Jewish and Christian communities, and that's what she's going to be focusing on tonight, is women in ancient Christianity, and that's definitely something I've been interested in a long time, so I'm ready to hear what you have to say about that. So, and she is a disciple of Christ, member at a local congregation, South Hills, correct? So we're glad you're here. Thank you.
So I am going to talk about how Christians have thought about women. And I'm going to divide it into two parts. So I'm going to start with early Christianity. So I don't know where to look and who to ask questions of here. It's your own. It'll be your own fault, Joe. Yeah. So let's see what color I want to write in here. All right, so first I'm going to talk about the era known as the patristic period. That's a kind of old term, and some historians use exclusively the term early Christian writers. Actually, for tonight, the word patristic works really well because it refers to the era of the fathers of the church. So who do I mean by the fathers of the church? Basically anybody who wrote from post-biblical material through about the 6th century. So that covers a lot of people. Some of them were primarily Greek thinkers and writers. Some of them were Latin thinkers and writers. But you know what? On this issue, it doesn't really matter because in terms of the thought world, they were all imbued with Greek philosophy, even if they got it through Latin translations. So what do you remember about Plato? You remember anything about Plato? The allegory of the cave. It's a great thing to remember, actually. If people read nothing else in Plato, and if they read the allegory of the cave, so what do you remember about the allegory of the cave? Sorry. I'm going to pick on you since you, yeah. Yeah, because they've been accustomed to seeing what they thought of as reality in terms of the shadows cast on the back. I always have to think about where was the fire and where were the people, and it kind of makes me dizzy when I try to do that. But they took the shadows for reality. So what's the lesson for early Christian thinkers? What's the reality? And what's the shadow? The reality is the heavenly realm. Plato called it the realm of the ideas. For early Christian writers, it's heaven or God's realm, spiritual realm. So what's the shadows? Yeah, the world that we live in. So think about that. If you describe this world that you spend all of your time in, well, your time on earth, as the shadows, how does that rank or rate relative to the real thing? It's clearly secondary at best. So you may have heard the line, all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes on Plato. So some actually rejected this. Aristotle was kind of Plato's opposite on that issue. But Plato really ruled the day for millennium, at the very least. And he certainly rules the day in the early church. So what I'm going to do is look at how a couple of early church writers interpreted Genesis 1:27. Can you quote it? I have it written down, so I can do that. And I'm probably going to do it in the RSV, so maybe some of you know a different translation. God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Can you finish it? It's printed in the RSV with a series of semicolons. Your writing instructor somewhere probably told you not to use too many semicolons in one sentence. They never told the biblical translators that. Right? So after the second semicolon, male and female, he created them. So this is a problem. This is going to be an enormous problem for these patristic writers as they try to understand this issue of the image of God and the material that follows that second semicolon. Male and female, he created them. So why is that?
Because it would be essentially, if they created in God's image, which was a male image, then how do you deal with the whole issue of women, the female?
Yeah. So it would be really easy. And in fact, if there was a period and they put that male and female somewhere else, they'd have been really happy. And part of it is they could assign maleness to God without equivocation. But for the Greek thinkers, it's an even deeper issue of which gender is a secondary matter. This makes God look like he's got multiple parts, right? Duality in God. And one of the things about God and the realm of the ideas, Plato's notion of perfection, is that it's undivided. I'm going to tell a story that chapel designs. I don't know what you look at every Sunday. I've seen it, but I don't remember it. At Benton Chapel, at Vanderbilt Divinity School, I think a Neoplatonist architect did the interior design in that chapel, because at the bottom there's the back, behind the pulpit area, line. You go up another layer, and it's line. Then you go up another layer, it's line. And then up at the top, there's no division. So as you ascend to the heavenly realm, the multiplicity that we experience here in this world, that isn't. Because up there, it's all one. But Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So how are we going to understand that? They're puzzled by it and troubled, I think. So, image of God, they all going to say this. What do you mean? I don't know. Do you ever have these conversations? What does that mean? What is it about us? What is it about us that is in God's image? Some people, but basically it comes down to two kinds of answers. There are probably others, but these are the two primary ones. Free will, or the capacity to choose, or is it our capacity to think? You want to vote? Well, it's worth thinking about. I mean, it's been an issue that Christian thinkers have worked on for a long time. Anybody imbued with Greek philosophy picked reason, of which will would be one part. Right? So, in the image of God, he created them. God. Human beings have rationality. That's why we're thinking creatures, because we have been created in God's image. All right. So far, so good. Are you all here with me? Are you going to stick around? But the gender question is going to come into play. It's going to come into play in a big way, because God is without body, right? Incorporeal is the word that philosophers would use, right? Not embodied. We are embodied. Jesus Christ was embodied. It was an embarrassment for some of them, frankly. It was a scandal. Paul was right. If you're a Greek thinker, embodiment is a scandal. It's a problem. But it's a part of the tradition, so you have to figure out how you're going to think about it. But male and female, what are we going to do? So I want to focus on one thinker who is, everybody doesn't say what he said, but what he says is so impressive and important for people who follow him that we can't, I don't think, ignore him. So Augustine died in 430. That's really, timing is everything, you know. Augustine died in 430, about the same time the Roman Empire was collapsing. Part of what that means is it's going to be 500 years, 700 years before there's another person who thinks as broadly and as systematically and writes as much as he did. There just wasn't the wealth of resources to support it in the way that he had it. He lived in North Africa in a podunk place called Hippo. Everybody should live in a place with a colorful name like that. So Augustine he wrote a commentary on, gosh, if not all the Bible, much of it, and spends a lot of time on Genesis, spends an enormous amount of time on the first few chapters of Genesis. Because as a Greek thinker, he's a Latin writer, but he's imbued with this Greek worldview. He's got to try to understand how it can be that human beings, male and female, are in God's image. So, God is going to be one, God is going to be unitary, God is not going to be divided. That's a premise that he's got to hold on to. Male and female, how can that be? So he winds up thinking about the characters in the story. You know the story, right? Where does Eve come from? Ah, I don't know which story you're reading now. The first story, right? It comes from Adam's rib. That's important. So I'm gonna do some. I don't draw. I just don't draw, but I do draw lines. So Adam, and we'll just put Eve down here. It fits, actually. Adam donates a rib to get from which Eve is fashioned. And that's important for Augustine because it means that she is somehow identified to a greater extent with bodiliness. So all this corporeality that's such a problem for the Greeks and Augustine gets expressed through Eve. So Eve stands for the body. Adam, in the image of God, he created him. Oh, that must be Adam, I guess, says Augustine, right? In the image of God, he created him. And God's, what we just said, okay, God's image, reason applies here. So Adam represents reason or signifies reason. Now, Adam has a body, but if you asked Augustine what is Adam's primary identity, it would be as a rational being, rational creature. In the image of God, he created him. Now, Eve comes out of that rib, so she represents the body. All right, so, and why does God create Eve? What does the text tell us? To be a help. Help me, yeah. Did you ever study Hebrew? Oh, you can do this better than I can then. Azer, the word Azer? It's been 10 years, she said. It means helper appropriate or a fit helper, right, which comes out in that kind of old-fashioned sounding term, helpmeet. So what kind of help does Eve give Adam? According to the story, she takes him down. I guess you could say not much of a help there. Yeah. Yeah. And you know that according to Augustine, that there is no fall until Adam eats. Right? It took Eve's eating wasn't sufficient. Why? Because she represents body. She doesn't represent the function of rationality, which chooses one thing over another or thinks about it. Although the story has her thinking. You know, she looks at it, and the serpent engages her in some conversation, and well, it looks good, and you'll have knowledge of good and evil, right? That doesn't sound too bad, right? But no, as Augustine reads the story, because she comes from the body, she represents the body. And so that's the kind of help that she is. She's a helper fit for procreation. And I guess if Augustine could have had God near, and did you ever want to shake your finger and wish you could tell God one to do this? And if for any other task, a second man would have been a better help. He says that quite explicitly, right? So the only task that woman is appropriate for, the only task that she's fit for, is the task of procreation. Yeah. So there you go. All right. So Adam represents reason, Eve represents the body. You could put morality up here. We could put soul or spirit. So those things are all analogous categories for someone like Augustine. Reason is, in fact, a function of soul.
And this is a very dualistic world.
Yeah,
Right.
because Plato was a dualist. Yeah. So what's a dualist?
Two things. So it's black and white. It's body. It's soul. It's
Yeah.
everything falls into two categories.
Things generally fall into two categories, although I do sometimes say this. Being a dualist isn't quite like being pregnant, because it does come in gradations. So there's some people who are extreme dualists. An extreme dualist would deny the goodness of creation. I think Augustine gets about that close. He doesn't quite ever say it, but he's pretty close to it, which is a problem, right? It's a theological problem because God created all this and then said it was good. So Christians have to maintain the goodness of creation if they're going to be monotheists in the line of Jews, right? You can't just decide on your own to dump it all. Some did, and the church showed them the door, in effect. So they create their own kinds of Christian communities. But most of the early fathers were really quite dualist, right? So Eve represents body, or the passions. Or material. All right. So this really kind of interesting dualist lineup here. Everything that has to do with rationality and morality and spirituality belongs properly to Adam. Now, Eve has a soul. She has a mind. But she doesn't signify that. She signifies the body. Adam has a body, but he doesn't signify corporeality. He signifies reason and spirituality. And I think it's pretty hard for us to understand how important those symbolic values were to folks in the ancient church. That because the shadows are the real thing. Those were so important in understanding spiritual truth. So this is the view of women that predominated. Oh, I don't know. I'm going to say. Well, I thought I'd let you decide how long. So do you think so?
Well, I think part of the reason why we still have a lot of these issues is because these things have seeped into our theology throughout
well
the.
be.
I mean, I'm not saying that we're as bad as we were in that regard, but I do think there's still a lot of that.
Yeah. So if you wanted the world to be properly ordered, we hear a lot about this kind of talk in our government, right? You got to get, things have to be properly ordered for a good society. The Greeks were concerned with that too. And from Aristotle, they get the notion that the more rational should control the less rational. That makes a measure of sense, right? Otherwise, everybody's just getting whipped about by what they feel like doing rather than what they know they ought to do. So I fundamentally have no complaint about that, although the Greeks also thought that by virtue of having been born into slavery, you had a lower capacity for rationality than did somebody born free. Yeah. And so they take that presupposition to the larger society. If that is the case, then it's totally appropriate that all of these things on the lower half of this duality are being controlled by the upper half. Right? You wouldn't want it any other way, frankly. Augustine is completely clear on. Now, this is kind of an interesting trick here, because what does it mean to be saved? And if you ask that question of the kind of teaching that Augustine lays out, I think you get this, that for man, if you're like unto Adam, right, then it's more of what is your natural, more of what is your nature. Right? If you're like Eve, you have to somehow overcome that which is natural to you. It's entirely possible that it would be a real dualist who would say because they represent body, women can't be saved. I'm sure there were some who said things similar to that. So women have a kind of farther road to go. There's one way, though. There's a surer path.
Procreation.
I got a better one for you. Virginity. The opposite, actually. So it's been in the normal course of events for most women, it is a matter of procreation. And in antiquity, not just in antiquity, you did what your father told you to do. You married the one your father said you were going to marry. And most marriages were a matter of economics, family relationships anyway. It's not like you would likely have chosen a mate at all. But if a woman embraced virginity or chose virginity or became a virgin again, and they've used that language freely in the ancient church, then somehow that which identified her nature was overwhelmed and overcome by this choice that she'd made. So it's not a popular thing to talk about today. I think we have conflicted views about sex. We pass those on to the next generation, I'm sure. But in this case, if you were a woman and you embraced virginity, then you still had a body, but it no longer became your defining characteristic. You could more easily rise above it. Does that sound like good news to you? No, she says. No. Maybe. No, I can't read that face. Is that a yes or a no? Those are your choices, basically. And the truth of the matter is, we have stories of women in the ancient church who defied parental authority to embrace virginity, to choose Christianity, embrace virginity. If you're talking about Latin, Roman Christians now, my gosh, it was important for you to marry so that family line got passed on. And if you didn't, that was a real act of insubordination. And so this is you here being insubordinate to your better in terms of reason. How dare you do that? But you see how it's a theological value to do it, given the way you've been defined. So it doesn't sound attractive to you? Why? Why? I'm just curious. A lot of eggs in one basket. I guess so. So think of it this way. Here's your choice. You can obey your father and a husband, or you can embrace virginity. If I flip a coin, will that help?
I'd probably embrace virginity over obeying a man, but that would be modern days.
Yeah. Well, actually, it was, yeah, you had a bigger dose of it in antiquity, a much bigger dose.
Even if they chose that life, that doesn't mean that they were somehow not having to obey a man of some sort.
Explain.
Well, because women had very little power in general, so even if they were a virgin, there would still be men in power over them. Does that make sense?
It does.
So it wouldn't be like you'd somehow make that choice and have no one telling you what to do.
Here's probably your only choice. If you wanted to escape both of those.
Yeah. None.
Become a nun.
Oh.
And if you were lucky, you got into a women's community where perhaps you got an education, perhaps an education in the scriptures. So it might be your only course of action if you wanted to know as much about the Bible as was possible. Now, we are still talking about antiquity, and literacy levels were higher, much higher then than they. It's going to take 1,000 years to get back up to that level after the Middle Ages. But you may well have, you may be basically literate, but if you wanted a really good education in the scriptures, you probably had to become a nun. And then maybe you could be the head of the community, and you'd be the one giving orders. Jill likes that idea. No?
Except for the nun.
Well, it does. There is a catch here. That's for sure.
Would you still not at some point have to answer to a man, even in a female religious community?
If push came to shove at certain points, the bishop might come by and say, well, I don't like what you guys are doing. But in antiquity, we have really relatively few of those kinds of stories. It's been a little more common the last 1,000 years than the first 1,000. Historians are kind of crazy. Right. So Eve is every woman, Adam is every man. Adam is every one, he's also every man. Right? So we are all in Adam. For as in Adam all died, so in Christ shall all be made alive. So that mentality, that people are thinking that for sure. But Eve is every woman, Adam is every one and every man. So Eve is subordinate to Adam, and every woman subordinate to every man. I could put that up there, but then I'd have to move my thing to. So is that the case because of nature, as this philosophical argument would suggest, or is it the case because Eve was the one who sinned? Early Christian writers couldn't make up their minds. Sometimes they said the one, and sometimes they said the other. That it was fitting that women be subordinate to men because of Eve's actions. And other times they argued for this thing that was, in their mind, a part of the natural order of things.
Were they also subordinate because of where they were and where they came from? Because I've heard that argument a lot.
Oh, from the rib?
Yeah.
That would be related. I think that's a species of this dualism here. Yeah. So that would be, that has not, you don't have to read the Bible to know that, right? You just know your Greek philosophy. And these names we get from the Bible, but otherwise, it's no big deal. Right? You could get that from Plato or Aristotle just as easily. Right. You know that Aristotle thought that, Aristotle liked to observe the world and draw conclusions from his observations. And he reached the conclusion that every time a male of any species plants a seed, what should come out is another male. But sometimes something goes wrong in the gestational process. And so it's a good thing, I guess, because then we get females. So that's from his observation of nature, his view of the physical world around there. So in the mind of this way of thinking, you're either a virgin or you totally represent materiality. And that needs to be controlled. I think this is the root of the virgin-whore dichotomy that's so common in our culture. That you can rise above this, but you can't exercise your physical reality. You can't use your body in the way that even the Greeks thought it was primarily for. If you do so, then somehow you're working at obliterating morality, soul, spirit, reason, even in the limited ways in which they show up. Now, what happened to women who couldn't conceive?
If their choices were procreation or...
Yeah, they would read parts of the scriptures where Hannah has this great grief because she can't, So they could identify with some women in the Christian tradition. If you're lucky, you have some capacity, some means to sublimate those needs. Yeah, I don't have anything more specific than that to suggest forward. There's always somebody who asks a question like that. Yeah.
It just seems like that's sort of a third option.
Well, yeah, it is. It's an issue that the Catholic Church faces today. Officially, it teaches against any artificial form of contraception, except that if one half of a couple is infertile, they can still have a real marriage. So on the one hand, there's a norm expressed, and on the other hand, a space for something that didn't fit the norm.
I think more of the conservative circles, it's more of an issue nowadays.
Today, I would think so.
Because it's, in some of those very conservative, it's said in their vows, your job is to procreate, period. And so, if they can't procreate, then there's a problem there.
Yeah, I presume so. Now, what I don't know is in the circumstances that you're alluding to, are there other ways to solve this problem? Doctors,
Some,
Some
don't want that.
Yeah. It creates a complicated set of relationships because here, this was a relationship. We tend to reduce them to these things that they represent, but presumably, if you read the story a little, it's a relationship. And relationships often lead to new people, right? Little ones that make lots of noise and mess. I have a colleague whose wife had triplets a year and a half ago. Triplets. Boy, as he says, diapers cost a lot. Yeah. So, interesting issue. But it's a relationship, and there are consequences, and yet not every relationship is the same. So I don't know. I assume, and some of this is assumption, because women show up in the history of Christianity when they're a problem. Read your Paul. Women show up when they want to talk in church. And Paul says when they're dressing inappropriately, here's fine. Yeah, so that's a kind of rule of thumb, that women are probably present even if they're not being mentioned, because they're usually only mentioned if there's a problem. But we do know that this way of thinking prevailed. It didn't go away. Just because people stopped really being terribly committed to Greek philosophy and committed to any philosophy, it was the predominant reading of Genesis that governed church law, civil law, all those issues that come into play. So that the wedding vows as they emerge require that the woman vow obedience, because that's appropriate for the submissive ones. I think that a lot of women embraced the monastic life to avoid this, to avoid being primarily identified like this, or to gain a measure of autonomy. You were subordinate to the community. You weren't a completely autonomous individual. But in every religious community, in all the Benedictine communities for 1,000 years, you got to vote. But Benedictines were really democratic communities. So you would vote as to who was the abbess. So you wouldn't elect somebody who was going to put everybody under her thumb. You'd elect somebody who knew how to listen and, sorry? You would not have been elected. All right, some of it's too bad for you. So they all remembered Paul, women should be silent, and I suspect that most women were, except there's a whole category of women who don't maintain silence. And those are women we would call mystics. Women. So if you're a theologian or if you're a priest, you probably have minimal literacy if you're just a local priest, but you learn how to read, and it's your job to preach from the scripture somehow, or occasionally, now and again. No woman ever does that. No woman's ever bishop. No woman's ever in a position of leadership because it violates all of that. But what if you claim that God has spoken directly to you? You bypass the book. You bypass the structures of leadership. And you develop a reputation for holiness. And we know, oh my gosh, the Middle Ages is littered with women who had a reputation for holiness. And they would come, they were renowned to the extent that folks would travel to visit them, to seek advice, to sit in their presence. Not even to say anything, or not even to use words, but merely to be in their presence. If you were a woman and you wanted to exercise your spiritual dimension, being a mystic was your best bet. Now, how you arrange those in visions from God, I don't know. We're going to talk a little bit in a minute about one of them. But it comes usually along with virginity. Sorry, Joe. That's just the way it is. All right. So virginity, and sometimes the power of voice, the capacity to speak, and sometimes to speak truth to power. There's a woman who was an abbess in central Germany, or in the 10th century, who went on preaching tours. And in fact, she is known to have lectured and done like this with her finger at one of the popes, probably several of the popes, who were embracing worldly values instead of the message of Jesus. But Hildegard could do this because she claimed to have been given a message from God, a requirement from God that she speak to these things. So these are extraordinary women. Yeah, I wouldn't be one of them either, for sure. So if you were going to be remembered in this about 1,500 years, it's because you're a woman who has special messages from God. There are almost, you count on one hand, maybe have a few fingers left over, if you want to count mothers who somehow develop a reputation for saintliness. There's one, a very notable exception is Augustine's mother, whose name was Monica. Go figure. All right, so I'm going to run us forward to the 19th century. Can you do that? Yeah, you won't get whiplash or anything like that.
Your remote works faster than mine does.
Sorry?
Your remote works faster than mine does.
Well,
Go ahead.
while you're with this real early part,
Sure.
What if some women didn't fit this before we really got into the church being controlled by the kind of theology that you're talking about, like some of the writings that have been discovered in the Nag Hammadi indicate that there were women that were really strong
Exactly.
leaders in the church.
Yeah. We do have extra canonical writings, such as the Nag Hammadi writings, that in which women figure prominently. There was a big splash a couple of years ago. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, was that it? The fragment, it was the size of a business card. I'm not sure how you draw much in the way of conclusions from it. So here's one way to think about that. There are other ways, but we'll start with this. So I think that I told you I don't draw, but I do lines. So I think early Christianity, and I'm going to say up to 150, right? Early Christianity is characterized by a lot of pluralism. And what happens in 150 is we begin to get some defining. And the defining that happens in 150 isn't, I don't think, itself dualist. In fact, that defining gets us the Old Testament as a part of the Scriptures. Because if you're really dualist, you don't like that Jewish Bible, right? You really don't like that Jewish Bible. So one way to think of it is early Catholic Christianity. You don't have a Roman Catholic Church until the 16th century, but you have early Catholic Christianity, small c, we would say, gets a real boot right here, gets a real undergirding around 150. But the history of the early church is really one of narrowing down those options. And this, I can defend the decision on 150 to have a two-part canon, to say that Jesus was truly human. Because if you're a real dualist, your Savior is not going to have a body. Trust me. That's pretty disgusting. Jesus with a body, right? But if anything, if the Gospels are telling us anything, they say that, right? That he was really human, even to the point of having a moment of despair on the cross, right? So that and the Trinitarian formulations of the 4th century, and that he was fully human, fully divine. I actually am willing to be traditional enough on some of those issues. There's no necessary connection between all of that and the dualism that puts women in that lineup. Does that make sense? At least I don't think there is a necessary connection. It gets wedded together. It really does. And then I had a dear, much beloved teacher in graduate school who, he never had much evidence for this claim that I'm going to repeat from him. But it's the kind of thing that your gut says could be. That part of the reason that women, and there are women who figure prominently as leaders. Phoebe, Junius. So Paul writes to some women, calls them co-workers in the Lord. My goodness, co-worker. Paul calls her co-workers in the Lord. But there were, by the middle of the 2nd century, some of these groups that become marginal, some of these groups had women as leaders. Or here's what they did. They got together and you drew a straw. Come on, draw a straw. Oops, she's got the short straw. That means she gets to preside over the Eucharistic celebration that we have. On the principle that everybody present who'd been, however they were initiated, we don't really know, was equally competent to do so. And so my beloved teacher, Jack, used to say that he thought that anxiety about that heretical groups bled over. Whether, there's just enough of a ring to it, but you could never, it's not the kind of thing you can really prove.
You make that observation because this couple, for the first time, helped the Eucharist on Sunday.
I'll let him pick too. So how was it?
It was
Did your knees shake a little bit?
not really.
I speak in front of groups all the time, but my knees kind of go a little bit like this
Yeah,
when it's
yeah,
communion.
You were concerned, or I was,
Yeah.
make sure that everything goes right.
Yeah.
But it was, to use the word honor isn't appropriate, I don't think, but
Yeah. It was the thing that got some of the opponents of that group, that even women could draw those straws. So I don't know. I don't know that Jack was right about that point, but I can't ever shake that idea. There's some things you hear that you go, and they go away, and there's some things that stick because you can't prove them, but you can't get rid of the idea either. There's something to it, maybe. So I don't know if I answered your question well or not.
Yeah, you indicated there was a period when women didn't
Yeah.
powerful leadership
Yeah.
in the church.
And I know St. Paul and Jesus didn't have as much of a problem with women, but as time goes on, then this narrowing happens. So like the pseudo or the Deutero-Pauline, you do hear more of
Right.
honing into
Right.
women being subservient more so and silent, where you don't have that as much in Jesus' time and in Paul's
And even though Paul says, let the women be silent in churches, he's also, at many points, he's engaged in a conversation with himself about these issues. But the later Pseudo-Pauline writings are real clear. There's not a question in their mind. Yeah.
And I think
Paul's another one with that virginity thing.
Well, and you think of Gospel of Mary Magdalene and some of those, they are much later writings. They're nearer that 150.
Right, right.
So a lot of those didn't get included. We don't have a single
Right.
document in the New Testament that was written by a woman or in the name of a woman.
Right.
And I think partly it's those written documents were out there and being written, but it's a narrowing with a patristic type thought.
It's, you know, so the books in the Bible, they're kind of what we got, right? We're stuck with them in some cases. It's kind of like a sifting process, right? You know, I don't know if you've ever made. I tried to take stuff from a compost thing, and you know, it was like it was a comedy of errors. But I created this little mesh thing that I could shake and keep the big pieces out. And the early church is doing like this. And every time it comes to makes a decision about one idea or another, it's pretty clear that something's fallen by the wayside here. Some people fall by the wayside. Books fall by the wayside. Some ideas fall by the wayside. So I think women have always had roles to play. Just got narrower. There were actually some pretty prominent women who were part of, in the early church, what was called the widows, an organized group. And they did then what widows in the churches do today. They help all the rest of us do the things that need to be done. They help take care of people in the community. But you were actually enrolled in the order of widows, and some writers said, well, you have to be X number of years old and really a widow, not just never married. Right, so, but again, it was somebody wanting to control who they were and what they did. And it's better to stay at home and pray for people. Sometimes you need more than prayer. I wrote the name Thecla on the board. One of those set of stories about Paul that didn't make it into the Bible. It's probably from roughly that period of time. Is a story about a woman named Thecla she really wants to follow Paul, and he's not too. He can't pay any attention to her at all. What's really interesting about Thecla is not the story about her. It's full of miraculous things, crazy things happening, but that in the 200 or 300 years after the middle of the 2nd century, Thecla was one of the most popular names for Christian girls. So the story about Paul and Thecla is not in the Bible, but Christians were reading it. And they were naming their daughters Thecla. And we know that from inscriptions on tombstones in the Roman Empire. Going to whip you around to the 19th century. So I teach the class the students see the most of me. Most students see me in is world religions, and I was kind of interested in what do students have in their minds as chronology of life, history, historical events, and I'm usually horrified. But yeah, so I will say, so 1850. So what's happening around 1850? And there's only one answer. The one answer that comes up all the time is the Industrial Revolution. So they learned something about the Industrial Revolution. I am going to take us post-Industrial Revolution. It's really hard to imagine a time when goods were not produced mechanically, were not produced in bulk, were not produced in a factory, but to imagine small families making everything they needed or acquiring just a few things that you couldn't do on your own from the village. But that's what we mean by the Industrial Revolution. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, you might have been obedient to a husband, but your contribution to the family and the family's economy was absolutely essential. Right? I had to go to school and graduate school to realize how ridiculous the rifleman is. Anybody remember seeing episodes of the rifleman? No, too young. There he is, Chuck Connors, raising his boy on the western frontier all by himself. I don't even know the story where mom, I'm sure mom died, but you didn't. You married again because you couldn't manage a small farm without a wife. You couldn't do it. Even Chuck Connors couldn't do it. So the Industrial Revolution is the time in which all of those means of production that had been closer to home go outside the home. And the consequence of that is that some people, mostly men, then leave the home to go to work, right? Women stay at home, generally. But having said that, I'm going to contradict it in a second here. So this is a little trickier because I think this is a very real phenomenon in history of Christianity, but it's not quite of the same order as Augustine and his theology. In the 19th century, in the United States and in Great Britain, and in some countries, some other places in Europe, Germany went through this. And scholars in the 20th century created a term for it, called it the cult of true womanhood, the cult of domesticity, that takes over as a primary way of thinking about women and their place. So this emerges post-industrial revolution when women are primarily in the home, and the home is no longer a center of economic activity, right? Except in this regard. Women now are no longer producers of economic goods, they're consumers. Right? That shift takes place in the course of the 19th century. And it's kind of amazing to me how it affects Christian thinking. Right? So whereas Augustine wrote what I explained earlier, he wrote it in these big books, and he preached about it from his pulpit in Hippo. These ideas were spread through novels, magazines, from the pulpit too. But those two vehicles of popular culture in the 19th century. So the printing press, cheap novels, and cheap magazines spread these values, and they became rather like Augustine's theology and with the Greek emphasis, they became entwined with Christian teaching in a way that it's I think, still difficult to tease out. So four elements of the true woman. So now I'm going to write them down here, and I'll bet you could all tell me what that refers to, each of these. All right. So somehow, in the 19th century, we begin to have purveyors of popular culture making the point that women are more naturally pious than men. Women are more naturally spiritual. They have the softer heart that loves Jesus. I just added that little flourish there, but it's exactly the kind of thing that they would have said. That women are by nature more able to make the submission of their will to the will of God. So I've got submission down here, number 3. It doesn't matter where they are. But think about it. If you are in American culture with its go get it, go do it, forge your own identity kind of thing. But if the gospel tells you to obey, who's going to be better at that? So the cult of domesticity said women. Purity, your virginity is the most important thing about you, should only be surrendered on your marriage night. And this is the basis of it all. I maybe should have put it first. But women were nonetheless expected to be submissive to their husbands, to males in authority. And so that would clearly have also applied in the church, where they're beginning to see women in leadership positions in the churches. Do you know where they first show up? In the crazy places. Quakers, right? The fringe movements. If you've got little to lose, women stepped out and were often in positions of leadership. The holiness movements, Pentecostal churches later, it's like 1900, but in Pentecostal churches, again, the Spirit's speaking to me directly. I don't need ordination because God is going to work directly through me. Other than that, in this cult of domesticity, women owed their submission to their fathers, their husbands, the mayor, because all these public positions of authority are male. And then the last point there is domesticity. All of this rests on an understanding that isn't unique in this era, but it's certainly strong here, a distinction between the public and the private spheres. The public sphere is the sphere for males, right? And women rule in the private sphere. The Greeks had a really strong public-private dichotomy. A Greek woman got married and you hardly ever saw her again because she didn't go out of the gynoeceum. There's a room in the house where women didn't leave. Roman women had a little more freedom. But this cult of this domesticity here clearly indicated that women had this place, and while it's a little bit tricky because she's the angel of the hearth, the goddess of the hearth, and her rule is law at home, except I guess when Dad's home. Yeah, because she has to be submissive to him. So this is kind of interesting. It's got some of the same elements that Augustine's view, except this one, this notion that somehow women are more inclined to piety. Any ideas why they thought that way?
Did the Puritans have anything to do with it?
Well, this is going to be post-Puritans, but you know one of the things associated with Puritans is that if you looked at the church rolls for all those New England churches, you know what you had to do to be a member of the Puritan church? You had to stand up and testify that God had worked in your life, that you had the conversion experience. And if you read those rolls, more than half the names are women. So women predominated in the churches. And that carries over into the 19th century. That doesn't change. Oh, wait. Is it different today?
I think there's an image of women who are more pious than men.
Mm-hmm. I think there is. I agree. Are they? I mean, there's the image. Do you think they are?
I think they are.
Is it for reasons from nature? Yeah. So Augustine would say, when a woman is pious, it's going against her nature, so it's an even better thing, I guess. He doesn't actually say that. But I think actually it's a bigger pat on your back for a woman to reach a high level of piety in Augustine's ideology. But here, it's who you are, unless you fall. If you fall, how far do you fall? Pretty far. You fall pretty far. You go down. So if you don't maintain this purity and the submission, I guess, you're not going to do very well at this. So it is the case that I think the churches today would collapse if women walked out the door. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you completely in that regard. Lord knows the Catholic Church would go under. And actually, one theory, I don't know, I can't ever decide if I subscribe to this theory or not. One theory about the priest shortage in the Catholic Church today is that just enough women are really mad about things and that they're not encouraging their sons. No, I don't know if mothers have. I never had a son, so I don't know if mothers ever have that kind of control over their sons. But it was the case in an earlier time. Parents encouraged it in a son. And not enough of them, Catholics aren't having enough boys, sons, kids at all, and they're not encouraging them. So this is a package deal. You can't really pick and choose from it. You embrace it all. There was one pesky little problem with the cult of domesticity in the 19th century, mostly in the United States. Yeah, in Britain too, sorry. Thinking out. It doesn't apply to poor women. It doesn't apply to African American women. And it doesn't apply to immigrant women. Think. Who worked in all those factories? We're not. I remember some recent story about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It was on
PBS, a documentary.
There you go. They were all women who died. The doors were all locked. Yeah. So this ideology applied only to women of a certain type, a certain color, certain socioeconomic status, which, and just for me, feeds into the notion that it's the woman's primary role as consumer that it was concerned with. Part of our problem today, I think, is that I think we've got Augustine in our head, and we've got this in our head. Now, I don't know if they're in the same places in our head. That we've got, on the one hand, notions that women somehow are more inclined to piety and purity. You know, it's her job to draw the line in a dating relationship. You know, boys will be boys, right? So that's a sort of casual and dismissive part of it, but I think it's a real part of it. But if she does, then there's some benefits there, right? You're the goddess of the hearth, as it were. That's nothing that Augustine would ever really offer you. You know, no exalted positions there.
How do you deal with modern theology not fitting into a lot of this, like with the feminist movement and with newer concepts of roles for women?
So I think that the dualism of Augustine, that line there, and both of these are really they're not the driving ideologies today, but I don't think they're gone. And your example of the women in conservative religious movements sometimes, I think, reflects that. Most modern theologies, contemporary theologies, explicitly reject the kind of dualism that Augustine worked with. And I don't know how far you'd get with one of those, with that list of characteristics for women before people started throwing things at you today. Because it doesn't fit. See, this fit the emerging social world of the 19th century. Oh, for some people, right? It doesn't fit our world today. So our job today, I think, is to try to figure out how we can figure out how to talk about men and women in ways that emphasize commonalities rather than differences without ignoring the differences. So, I mean, I don't have answers to those. I have questions. I don't have answers to those questions. Just that if we don't think, if we don't think explicitly about it, I think these things raise their heads and they begin to rule decisions that people make. Was it Crowley High School or Burleson or some nearby school district? A high school had scheduled a motivational speaker who basically was going to do this.
Yeah, it was
Richardson.
Seminary professor who did my wedding, and he was the one that spoke out about that guy. His name is Lookadoo, and the kids started throwing up things too. But yeah, he was essentially going down that route.
So there are sub-communities where this exists. I think it's not the churches that would invite me to come talk. Let's just put it that way. All right. So you have to figure out if you're going to hold on to this, what do you have to do to the world around you to make this make sense? All right? You have to protect your children from. Yes. Yeah. Reality. Yeah. Put them in the cave and throw a fire in the front of it and see what they come out with. Yeah, I don't know how you do it, but I understand that if you have that in your head, you're going to fight school boards and.
Isn't that mainly though why many of those who fall into that camp homeschool?
I think it absolutely is, because you at least eliminate the school influence, right?
And the other children who are the horrible influence.
Right.
Well, David Grant.
David who? Sorry.
Had a program here recently where he said these
Oh,
gals
yeah.
are men and women bows that are raised with this and come to the university where the preacher says it's this way or hit the road, they're hitting the road.
They're going to hit the road, yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
Except if they're in one of those Christian fraternities or sororities.
that's an interesting phenomenon. That's,
Side note.
side note, yeah. No, be careful, you might learn something, and if you learn something, you might be changed, you know. Higher education is not for people who want to be in a closet in any case. Now, he teaches Bible, I do not. I'd rather eat nails than teach Bible to 18-year-olds in Texas. Huh? Yeah. Can you imagine?
No, I'm from West Texas and actually know somebody that started at TCU and took a Bible class. I don't know who she had, I can't remember, and left.
It doesn't
Went
matter.
back to West Texas to go
Yeah.
to a Baptist school.
Yeah.
It was too much.
It was too much, yeah. And some of them are a little more sharp than the others, but they're none of them as, well, yeah. Yeah. So you have to figure out what you want. And I think people don't necessarily, it's a funny word, that word Christian, in Texas Christian University. You know.
Get rid of it.
They pretty much have.
Well,
TCU now, and they don't say it.
yeah, admissions people never say Texas Christian. And you know, if you look at old pictures of the basketball team, that's what the uniforms say, Texas Christian. But you know, TCU is all it is now. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean,
Oh no, I don't know where you're going.
I'm going to turn around here and get something else.
No, I was just gonna say, with sort of changing views on gender in general, how that will affect these ideas going forward, and in the church. I mean, you know, on Facebook, like you said, like 80 different things for your gender.
80? 80?
I didn't know it was 80. There's a lot.
I mean, 20 plus. A lot of options for how you define your own gender.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that these kids have Facebook pages. I point at you, Gina, but yeah, that's true. So I knew Facebook was doomed No. I knew Facebook was doomed when I saw that TCU had a Facebook page. I thought, this is it now.
Yeah.
When institutions start getting into it, it's not.
And once the parents jump on it, they're way
Yep.
off of it onto
Yep.
something else. When my mom got in, I knew it was doomed.
See, everybody has their page. We're gonna start there. So I'm just turning it over for you. They said what?
Emerging ideas about gender.
Oh, I just did that perfectly.
I mean, it is a good question. I mean, these roles don't stack. These roles don't apply.
Right. It assumes fixed. It assumes that there's a whole lot that you can conclude from nature, and that's a highly contested category today. Yeah, for sure. So we can talk about more. Don't want to cut that off so much. Other than my hope was to explain what I think are some of the roots of the confusions that we live with today. Our social reality is one thing. And yet, I think either of these ideologies, I think they pop up at weird times. I know they pop up in my mind at weird times, and I study this stuff. So if you're not explicit in pushing them away, I think they're going to take over. But I couldn't resist this. So I'm going to talk about one of those virgins. Oh, two of them, I guess, actually, because Anselm was one. So, two stories, and there's the short version and the longer version. And just give you a quick background. Anselm of Canterbury was probably the most important thinker after Augustine. So 430 and then 1109. Wow, it's a lot of time in between. And he 1109. So he's a Benedictine monk, and he's an abbot, and he's doing all this and writing all this about the time of the Norman invasion of Britain. So long ago all this was. But he wrote a book called Cur Deus Homo. And I'm going to try to give you the quick summary of the argument in that book. So, who sinned? Oh, Adam sinned. Human beings sinned. Who did they sin against? God. So, who should pay the price for this? Human beings. But because God is the one offended by sin, God's honor is so great that only God can repay that. Now, think about that. There's a debt due, a price to be paid for sin. Human beings should pay it, but they can't. So that's why we had to have the God-man. Why God-man, basically, is the title of the book. And in that book, it's about that fat. It's a dialogue, kind of like those Plato's dialogues where you don't really want to not be the main character because the other people are idiots, right? So boso, B-O-S-O, probably the origin of our word bozo, asks stupid questions, and he's always being bested by Anselm. But here at one point he tells this little story. Suppose someone, for example, assigns some task to his servant and directs him not to throw himself into a pit which he points out to him and from which he simply cannot escape. Suppose that servant, having no regard for the command and warning of his master, voluntarily throws himself into the pit that's been pointed out to him so that he cannot perform the task assigned. Do you think this inability can in any way excuse him from not performing that assigned task? So he's obviously talking about Adam, who is told, don't eat. And what does Adam do? He eats. He threw himself into the pit. Just so inexcusable is man, who has voluntarily brought upon himself a debt which he cannot pay, and by his own fault disabled himself, so that he can neither escape his previous obligation not to sin, nor pay the debt which he has incurred by sin. So it's just not just one story along the way. Most of what he gives is not stories, trust me. So if we fast forward to the 15th century. I've never been to Norwich, England. It's on the coast, North Sea. And there lived in Norwich an anchorite, a solitary named Julian. We don't know how she got where she was. She lived in a cell attached to the parish church in Norwich. And people from the town would come and bring her food, and they would take away what needed to be taken away, and they would visit with her. And she was near the church so she could hear services, right? And so she could be at Mass and receive the Eucharist, but not be in the world. On the 13th of May, 1373, we know very little about her. We know she lived in that place, and that various people came to visit her, looking for advice, for spiritual counsel. And we have in the town hall records, 3 or 4 people left money in their wills for her support. That's really the only hard evidence we have for her existence, other than a book that she wrote. So she tells us in this book that on the 13th of May, in the year of our Lord, 1373, when she was 30½ years old, she had a vision. She had a revelation, or a showing, as she called it. I'm going to read a little bit before we get to her story, the story that she tells. Here is a vision shown by the goodness of God to a devout woman. Her name is Julian, who is a recluse at Norwich. I desired 3 graces, she said. So she's bold. She's going to ask God for something that she wants. I want to have a recollection of Christ's passion. And I don't think she means a faint memory of it. Right? I want a bodily sickness, and I want to have by God's gift 3 wounds. It's not always easy to figure out what these mystics are asking for here. No. She gets be careful what you ask for, because you might get it, and she did. So when she is 30 and a half, she has 3 days and 3 nights of such sickness that they call for the parish priest. She's not apparently a recluse at this point. They call the parish priest, and he gives last rites, and they think she's going to die. So she gets right to the edge of death in the era before antibiotics. Right? But she doesn't die. And that's, I think, how she gets into the cell, where she spent the rest of her life trying to understand this gift that she'd received. All right. Now, this is my favorite thing from almost my favorite thing. So she talks about corporeal sight, spiritual sight, vision. I had a bodily vision and then a spiritual vision, and I don't really know what she means by that distinction, but it was obviously an important distinction to her. The Lord showed her, she refers to herself in the third person. God is to us everything that is good and comforting. He showed me, then she's now back to the first person, something small, no bigger than a hazelnut. Have you ever held a hazelnut in your hand? I've only ever seen them shelled, I think. I assume that this one is in the shell. I perceived that it was as round as a ball. It is everything that is made. I was amazed that it could last, for I thought that it was so little that it would suddenly fall into nothing. It lasts, and lasts because God loves it. This ball is the whole of reality. Right? All which lives, which lasts, which endures because God loves it. So there's more. I'm going to hold that for now. She wrote a short version of her vision, and then 20 years later published a longer version of it. Wrote this longer version. This story only shows up in the longer version. Now, she claims she didn't withhold anything from the first to the last. I don't know. Was she fudging a little bit? She didn't know what to do with this. This is from section 51 of the Showings or the Revelations of Divine Love. Now, we have no idea about her life. We have no idea. She calls herself unlearned. She wasn't illiterate, but she didn't go to university, right? So I think maybe she read Anselm, because here's the story. I saw 2 persons in bodily likeness, that is to say, a Lord and a servant, and with that God gave me spiritual understanding. The Lord sits in state, in rest, and in peace. Now that would be a great image of God, right? The servant stands before his Lord respectfully, ready to do his Lord's will. The Lord looks on his servant very lovingly and sweetly and mildly. He sends him to a certain place to do his will. Not only does the servant go, but he dashes off and runs at great speed, loving to do his Lord's will. And soon he falls into a dell, sometimes it's translated a ditch, and is greatly injured. And he groans and moans and tosses about and writhes, but he cannot rise or help himself in any way. And of all this, the greatest hurt which I saw him in was lack of consolation. For he could not turn his face to look on his loving Lord, who was very close to him, and in whom is all consolation. But like a man who was for the time extremely feeble and foolish, he paid heed to his feelings and his continuing distress, in which distress he suffered 7 great pains. And my 3 dots there, you don't really want to know about the 7 great pains. Trust me. Then the Lord says, see, my beloved servant, what harm and injuries he has had, and accepted in my service for my love, yes, and for his goodwill. Is it not reasonable that I should reward him for his fright and his fear, his hurt and his injuries and all his woe? Is it not proper for me to give him a gift, better for him and more honorable than his own health could have been? Otherwise, it seems to me that I should be ungracious. So God here she represents God as wanting to extend graciousness to this poor servant who didn't throw himself into the ditch. Has anybody here ever fallen? Have you ever fallen? Yeah, I'm not the only one, I trust. What do you not want to do when you're down on the floor or the ground? What do you not want to do? You don't want to ask for, you don't want to look around to see if there's anybody who's coming to help you because you're so embarrassed. You feel so awful. I mean, it might hurt, but it's embarrassing. We should know better. I should be able to stand up on my own 2 feet, right? There's something so profound in this that God's graciousness extends to this eager servant, a little bit stupid, shouldn't have run so fast, should have paid a little more attention, but didn't do what he did just so that he couldn't carry out the Lord's will. She must have read Anselm. Why would you make up a story like that if you hadn't read that first? And I don't want to make any claims for women here. I do want to make a claim for Julian, that God's graciousness predominates. God holds all of the world as a hazelnut in the palm of your hand and keeps it well. All things will be well, and all manner of things will be well. It's a profound theology of God's love and connection. Anselm, for all of his brilliance, was really parsing out who owes what to whom, how much. It's legal. He could have been a canon lawyer, the way he talks about things. And does that sound true to the way human beings act? He throw himself into the ditch, ignoring the heeding of his master. Whereas Julian has, I think, got her finger on a different piece of the scriptures. Now, Julian always claimed, I teach nothing other than what Holy Mother Church teaches, because you didn't want to be seen to be not teaching what Holy Mother Church teaches. But she parsed it a little differently. One way of thinking of it is that the servant is Jesus, right? Who was put on the cross, and I guess you could say fell a lot. I don't know. I think the stories are worth thinking about. So go think. Yeah, okay. That's pretty good timing, huh?
Any questions, comments? Okay.
Thanks for being here. Yeah, everybody's got choices. And, we'll all get back in time for Nashville, right?